Good evening. My name is Grace Dean, and I'm a sophomore psychology major here at the University of Alabama.
My name is Alex Glidewell, and I am also a psychology major here at the university.
We are working in conjunction with Dr. Leah Lefebvre to conduct a study that will investigate the occurrence of ghosting within familial and friendship relationships. The aim of this study is to explore the nature of this phenomenon as well as its cause and effect on the parties involved. Today we'll be giving you a comprehensive overview of our study's design, implementation, and importance. First, we will explain what questions we want to answer with this research. Second, we'll take you through our 3 stages of our data collection plan. Third, we'll discuss our various methods we plan to employ to analyze this data. And finally, we'll give you a tentative timeline of our future activities and discuss the possible implications of this research.
So the first part of this is understanding what ghosting is. So ghosting, as defined in our as defined in our research study, as well as previous literature, is a relationship dissolution strategy in which one completely ceases all communication with another person. Now, the prevalence of social media and the rise of social media has made ghosting a much easier route in dissolving one's relationships. It bypasses the awkwardness of avoidance in person while still achieving the goal of ending the relationship. Now, these are done primarily through media communication such as texting or social media, and in previous research, it's been mostly focused on romantic and sexual relationships such as through Tinder. Now, despite this, it's important to understand what ghosting is not. Dropping communication isn't necessarily ghosting. Sometimes 2 parties can drop communication because of distance or whatever, but that doesn't exactly mean it's ghosting. Ghosting is more of a one-sided phenomenon in which one person ceases communication and the other is given no idea of why. So, why are we investigating different types of relationships? Well, the different types of relationships, romantic, family, and friendships, have several different factors. Romantic relationships are much more defined in their status. There's a verbal confirmation and there's possibly different anniversaries and stuff like this. Now, there's 3 degrees to these types of relationships. There are non-exclusive romantic relationships, there are exclusive, and then sometimes you have a lifelong commitment, such as marriage. On the other hand, friendships are much less defined in status. Usually there's a lack of verbal confirmation to the outside world. Now these have many degrees in their relationship types. There are acquaintances, people that you get to know at work, there might be friends that you make at school, and then you have a thinner line which is between close friends and best friends. On an even other hand, there's actually families, which are even more defined in status than romantic relationships. These are implicit by nature and biological. You can't really choose who your mom and dad is. They only have 1 degree, and that's blood relatives.
So, what do we want to discover with this research? As Alex just mentioned, there are considerable differences between romantic, amicable, and familial relationships. We want to see if these differences will impact someone's inclination to ghost. This leads us to the question, does relationship type increase or decrease the likelihood that ghosting will occur? Our hypothesis is yes. More specifically, we predict that there will be an inverse relationship between the definition of a relationship and the likelihood that ghosting will occur. Now, when we refer to the definition of a relationship, we're referring to the commitment between 2 parties. To illustrate this, take a moment to think of someone you consider to be your best friend or have considered to be your best friend in the past. Now, was there ever a time where you sat down with that person and told each other, we are now best friends, and laid out the expectations you had for that relationship? Most of the time, no, right? Friendships occur naturally and casually over time. And because of the dynamic nature of this relationship, we would place friendships on the downhill side of this trend depicted in this graph. In sharp contrast, family relationships are significantly more defined. There's rarely any confusion about who your mother or father is or who your son or daughter is. And in fact, the expectations for these kind of relationships, such as parent-child relationships or spousal relationships, are laid out in law. Because of these clearly defined relationships, we would place family in the uphill side of this trend. Essentially, with friendships, we're saying that a bond that's easier to form is a bond that's easier to break. And with family relationships, we're saying that it's significantly harder to cut off a family member. And these are predictions that we will be carrying into our study. Now, whenever we're observing any kind of social interaction, it's crucial that we look at all points of view of all parties involved. In ghosting, there are two, and we've labeled them the initiator and the non-initiator. The initiator is the person who cuts off all communication with the non-initiator, becoming a ghost. In our study, we want to examine the motives of the initiator to take this action against the non-initiator. On the other hand, the non-initiator is the person who experiences the effects of this action. We want to investigate in this study the short-term effects on the non-initiators, such as the emotions they feel after being ghosted, or the various methods they employ to cope with this action. And we also want to investigate the long-term effects on the non-initiator. For instance, how being ghosted in the past might affect how they approach relationships in the future. All of these considerations lead us to form 4 primary research questions. With respect to initiators, we want to investigate what factors motivate the initiator to ghost a friend, and the same for a family member. For non-initiator, we want to observe what are the short-term and long-term effects for the non-initiator after being ghosted by a friend or being ghosted by a family member. Ultimately, the answers to these 4 questions will help us answer the big question: how does relationship type influence the ghosting process?
So within our study, we actually have data collection, and we have a 3-phase data collection method. Now, currently, we're still in it, but we're starting to wind out of it. We're in the literature and media review. Now, this is looking through previous scholarship and different social media commentary, such as different articles based on friendship, how friendships work and how they're dissolved, as well as ghosting, and then social media commentary, such as different discussion boards like Reddit. Now, this is still in the process, but findings thus far have shown us some different common themes that we can pick up. For the initiator, we are looking more at the motivations to ghost. Some of these include the new relationships. Possibly there's a decline in interest in the previous interactions, and maybe the initiator finds someone else that they want to communicate with. Maybe there's a reduction in inconvenience. Maybe some distance has been created, either emotionally or physically. Relationship maybe becomes burdensome, or maybe there's some significant conflict, or maybe even the initiator has done something that the non-initiator doesn't know about, but there is guilt because of this. We also have this idea of an investment payoff. Maybe the initiator looks at the relationship as a business transaction. Is what I'm putting into this relationship worth what I'm getting out of it? We also see some common themes for the non-initiator, such as the effects of this ghosting. There are several different types of short-term effects, such as self-blame, maybe there's anger, sadness, and confusion. But we also see some different long-term effects, such as reluctance to future emotional investment. Maybe there's some trust issues that are built because of this experience, and there's just a large detriment to their future relationships. Now, our second part of the data collection is our survey. They're mass distributed to UA students or public survey platforms, such as Prolific and Amazon Mechanical Turk. These will allow us to present different types of questions to our participants and pool several different types of participants. We're aiming to pool participants from the age range of 18 to 23 because that's generally the age range of college students. Our survey design is using both closed-ended questions and open-ended questions. Our closed-ended questions are designed to get some demographic ideas, such as relationship type, length, and some different ideas about the subject. These are asked how long was the relationship, what type of relationship was this, and there's also some different scales that we'll be using, such as we'll be measuring different empathy, investment, maybe there's different social network sites that the subject is using, or different emotions. Some of these questions are going to be like, on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being the least and 10 being the greatest, how did this experience affect your future relationships? Now, our open-ended questions are designed as write-in questions for our subjects or participants. These are going to allow our participant to describe in their own words how the relationship type or how the experience affected them. The last part of our data collection is through our interviews and focus groups. These are going to be used to corroborate our findings from the other 2 stages, the survey and literature media review, and kind of bring everything together. Now, the Participants will either share their experiences directly with interviewers in a one-on-one format or with a larger group. This design will again allow participants to share their experiences in their own words, yet we have not decided exactly how the focus groups will be segregated based on initiator or not initiator, or if these will be collective. These avenues will allow us to support and strengthen the validity of survey responses through real-time interactions with others. This will also help us in identifying and interpreting trends found in the survey responses.
So, through these various methods that Alex just touched on, we plan to be collecting a mass of data. But how do we plan to analyze all this data that we're gathering? Before we do this, we must keep in mind the goals of our research. These will serve as a kind of roadmap to organize and interpret this data. We plan to first separate our data into experiences dealing with friendships and experiences dealing with family relationships, and then separate those two into responses from initiators and non-initiators in these each respective ghosting experiences. The design of our study will help us accomplish this. So we're very excited to be entering on the ground floor of this research. As Alex mentioned previously, there's very little previous literature regarding ghosting, specifically in family and friendship relationships. Because of this, however, we are actually limited to broad, generalized research questions, and we will also likely be receiving participant responses that are subjective in nature. To account for this threat to the validity of our findings, we're following a convergent mixed methods design for our study. Essentially, this just means that we're going to be collecting quantitative and qualitative data and interpreting them together. Our quantitative data refers to our survey responses. They'll be collected digitally and thus processed and analyzed digitally, possibly through a coding package such as SPSS. We will then run statistical tests on these emergent themes, and these results will help inform our qualitative data, which will be our interviews and our focus groups. To organize these, we plan to record and transcribe our participant responses, then comb through, identify our emergent themes, and assign percentages to each. For example, 80% of participants reported feeling a decrease in self-confidence after being ghosted by a family member or a friend. The reason we chose this approach is because of the complexity of this topic. Our quantitative data helps us to identify overarching trends within our responses, and then our qualitative data will help us interpret and understand these responses. Interpreting both of these data sets together will help strengthen the validity of our otherwise subjective responses.
And so now we're going to be looking at how we're moving forward in this project. So here we have a study timeline. September and October have passed. And then we have just finished out November. Literature media review began in September and has just now becoming finished. Our October began our study designs, which we are finalizing, and November began our IRB review, which is also becoming finalized. Now, throughout starting in next semester, looking into January, that's possibly when we'll begin our survey distribution and beginning our first part of our analyzation. February will begin our interview and focus groups discussions, and March will possibly be our analysis too. May will possibly be the time in which we publish our work, both our literature review work as well as our findings. So why is this important? Well, this study is important for several different reasons. It allows us to deepen our understanding of why relationships end, and more importantly, why friendships end, and why people choose to end them in the way they do. We also gain more knowledge on the effect of relationship dissolution on others, examining the short and long-term effects on people's communication. This also shines a light on how technology has significantly changed the way we interact with others and what these changes can mean for our future. And all these ideas kind of process into the possibility of maybe even improving communication in a new digital age, where the sad but true reality is that ghosting is something people do.
And with that, we'll open the floor to questions.
So So I think you said your survey will be focused on UA students to the age range of 18 to 23. I know, the survey hasn't been done yet or distributed, but do you have any intuition on like the answers you may get for that age range compared to say 14 to 17-year-old, or even those who are retired and maybe lost a loved one and they're having new relationships in their life? So I guess my question is, to what degree does the age range you think affect the responses you're going to receive on this survey?
So I believe, thinking about it, how does age range affect the different responses? So I believe this can be answered through the idea of like what kind of experience these people have been through. So in the age range of 14 to 17, these are people just now getting into romantic relationships, even more distastefully sexual relationships, and they might not be as experienced or mature as people that are going into the 18 to 23 age range, or the college age range. Now, people older than that might have different responses to these kinds of questions based on their experiences. They've been out in the world, they've had many more different relationships, they've had much more mature and much more defined relationships than college students. College students are just now getting into the real world, while people older than that probably are more weathered.
I would predict possibly a large part of the differences that we would see in between those age groups, a large part of that being based on maturity, and a large part of maturity is coping skills. I would see possibly better coping skills in regards to being ghosted with reference to the non-initiator side of things. But we might also predict a decrease in the frequency of ghosting as you decrease the age of participants. Oftentimes, when you're younger, in preteen or teenage years, you're in a very limited sphere of social influence. High school, middle school, your hometown. So it might be a bit more difficult to completely cease communication with someone else, as we are defining ghosting to be. In contrast, as you get older, it could be significantly easier to cut off communication with someone else while you're living in an adult world with adult responsibilities and day-to-day tasks. Typically, as you get older, it takes more effort to maintain relationship than it would have when you were younger. So that's what we might predict to happen as well.
Quick follow-up. So yes. I think also in those age groups you have different ways in which the mode of the relationship is expressed. So for example, teenagers in high school and social media and using mobile devices, that their whole network of friends is really connected. Whereas older individuals, they can probably pull out of that kind of network maybe easier. So I don't know if that's a question or a comment. I'm just kind of curious where things might go if you look at that kind of the modality in which that relationship's expressed and maintained.
Yes, that's another great point. That would be another contributing factor to how, as you get older, ghosting likelihood might increase amongst those older age groups, for sure. Thank you.
I had a question. Do you think the recent rise in political tensions has led to an increase in ghosting amongst family or friendships?
Yes, that's a great point. So in the past, it's been very common for political and social ideologies to be handed down through family lines, primarily by word of mouth. But over the past few decades, we've seen a rapid rise and spread in technology that has led to a kind of revolution of ideas. Young people have more access to information than ever before, be it news media or the opinions of millions of people all over the world. So this has led them to commonly break away from the family mold of these are our values and these are our beliefs, and to form values and beliefs of their own. So yes, this has been seen, especially we've seen this commonly in our literature review, and even in our own personal lives, that there has been an increase in the fracturing within family units, a lot of times based on these political and social ideologies. For example, women's rights, racism and race relations, the dispute over border control, et cetera, et cetera. Most people in this room are watching have experienced these kind of disputes within their families. So yes, this has made it increasingly more common and much easier for family members to break away from one another over these tensions. That's a great question.
Yeah, and just going off that last answer, just curious on what led you personally to choose this project to do research on.
So I chose to do this project because I'm a psychology major and I plan to pursue psychiatry in the future. And learning how people interact and understanding what makes people dissolve their relationships and like fuels these kinds of different these ideas, these concepts, like communication is very important. So getting a better understanding of why people communicate, how people communicate, and how they stop communicating might help my future career and might help how I interact with others.
Right, exactly. Kind of going off that, when I was looking for a research project to get involved in, I did want it to be something that I related to personally because I'm sure everyone can agree something that you can relate to personally makes you significantly more passionate about that topic. So on a personal side of things, that's one reason why I chose this. Another reason why I chose this project would have to be Dr. Lefebvre. It was kind of remarkable when we were doing our literature review, the amount of times that we found literature on ghosting and they were referencing her papers and her previous research. A large amount of the previous studies that have already been done on this or literature that has been written about this topic has been done by Dr. Lefebvre. So the opportunity to not only assist but be a partner in conducting research on this topic with someone who's an expert in this field was a very exciting opportunity. So that's why I chose.
Well, I have one more question. So thinking about like practical implications, obviously you haven't collected it yet, but what are you hoping to sort of take away maybe personally, but also maybe professionally in the future for takeaways from the project?
Repeat your question one more time.
Yeah, so
Sorry.
just kind of takeaways. So like even thinking about the personal connection you all had with it, if you're thinking in the future, what sort of implications from having done this study do you have both personally and professionally you're hoping to maybe have? So like just different takeaways you think from the project.
One thing, it'd be really nice to have my name on a piece of paper that anybody reads. But for these more practical ideas, actually expanding the research on like so there's very little research on like family relationship dissolution as well as friendship dissolution. So like helping to expand this for future research for others, or maybe even future research I might conduct myself, is actually really cool and really important. As well as personally taking away, getting to understand again why people dissolve their relationships and why they choose to dissolve their relationships in these ways. Maybe in my professional line of work, years later down the line, when I'm helping others, maybe I can steer them away from these different kinds of negative communication times.
Right. For me, I know that personally, ghosting has become so common that I didn't even think about how I've been on both sides, the initiator and the non-initiator side of this phenomenon until we were really digging into it. And I had some time, I think Alex can agree, for some self-reflection, especially looking at the effects, short-term and long-term, that this action can have on the non-initiator. And I think ultimately all sociological and psychological research, we kind of touched on this at the end, but it's to improve our communication in the way that we relate to others. And I think a really big and impactful way that we can do this is to understand the impact that this action can have on others. I know personally and generally I've seen, and also through our research, I've seen a concerning lack of empathy in this new digital age that I believe the barriers of our screens has provided. You can't directly see, like Alex said at the beginning, it bypasses the awkwardness of breakups and it makes it easier to cut off someone because it is awkward because you're hurting the other person. I think if we were to fully understand the impact that ghosting someone else can have, maybe it can lead us in the future to think twice before we take that action.
Great. Thank you both.
Thank you.
Thank you.